Welcome. My name is Kelley Vlahos. I'm a senior advisor with the Quincy Institute and editorial director of our online magazine, Responsible Statecraft. I'm very proud to be hosting our discussion today. Can Blinken's visit to Beijing cool down U.S.-China tensions? This Sunday and Monday, Secretary of State Antony Blinken will be meeting with top Chinese government officials. This is much anticipated since it will be the first U.S. cabinet level visit to China under the Biden administration and the first since 2019. The meetings also come amid heightened tensions between the two countries over Taiwan, security issues in the South China Sea, trade and economic competition, and increased demands, especially by politicians in Washington, to address what they see are security and surveillance threats from Beijing right here at home. This meeting almost didn't happen. The first was canceled after a Chinese spy balloon was shot down by US military over the US in early February. Since then, there has been a flurry of seeming diplomatic overtures countered by aggressive language and chilly receptions. Neither side seems to trust each other, and the media coverage of relations on both sides appear to encourage the acrimony and underscore the zero-sum nature of the competition. So at first glance, this meeting seems like it may be a first step, but towards what? We have two of our best scholars and experts here at the Quincy Institute on US-China relations with us today to set the table and set the expectations for this auspicious visit. So I'm going to introduce our two esteemed panelists first, and then we'll get right into questions. First, we have Michael Swaine. Michael is a senior research fellow at the Quincy Institute's East Asia program. He was previously the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace Fellow, where he worked for nearly 20 years as a senior fellow, specializing in Chinese defense and foreign policy, US-China relations, and East Asian international relations. He has also served as senior policy analyst at the RAND Corporation and has authored, co-authored, and edited more than a dozen books and monographs, including Remaining Aligned on the Challenges Facing Taiwan and Conflict and Cooperation in the Asia-Pacific Region, a Strategic Net Assessment. Next, we have Jake Werner, who is a research fellow at the Quincy Institute. His research examines the emergence of great power conflict between the US and China and develops policies to rebuild constructive economic relations. Prior to joining Quincy, Jake was a postdoctoral global China research fellow at the Boston University Global Development Policy Center, a Harper Schmidt fellow at the University of Chicago, a Fulbright scholar at National Xiao Tung University at Taiwan, and a Fulbright Hays Fellow at East China Normal University in Shanghai. He is also the co-founder of Justice is Global, a project of the organizing network People's Action, which advocates for reforms to the global economy. So let's get started. We'll talk for about 50 minutes, and then I'm going to make sure I leave enough time for questions from the audience, or depending, when they and how they come in, maybe I will integrate them into the questions we have set for today. But we really would like to explore the dynamics of how we got here. So Jake, this visit was originally scheduled for February to build on the Xi-Biden meeting at the G20 summit in Bali. Can you talk a bit about what happened to postpone that visit and what the relationship looks like coming into it today versus in February?
Yeah, thanks, Kelley. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks to everyone for joining today. So as you said in the introduction, the balloon happened. The Bali meeting in November of last year between Xi Jinping and Joe Biden was very promising. It sort of put a stop to 2 years of almost continuous deterioration on top of the deterioration over the previous Trump administration. That deterioration was looking quite scary to both sides, and the meeting at the G20 summit in Bali last year between Biden and Xi, which lasted for 3 full hours, seemed to really lower the temperature. The Blinken visit was originally then scheduled for February of this year to follow up on that, to advance the progress that had been secured at Bali. And just days before Blinken was supposed to leave, suddenly a Chinese spy balloon showed up over the continental United States, spotted by civilians on the ground in Montana. It then very dramatically crossed the entire continental United States before the U.S. Air Force shot it down off the coast of South Carolina. Of course, this was a dramatic disruption to the plans to sort of ease the relationship onto a better track. The administration responded with a fair amount of restraint. It did not demagogue the issue. It certainly asserted the importance of American sovereignty and condemned the Chinese incursion for violating American sovereignty, but it did not make a big deal out of it beyond that. The Biden administration really wanted to keep the diplomatic track alive. That was not the case, however, for much of the U.S. Congress or for many politicians who sort of hysterically reacted to this rather unusual but nonetheless banal case of a major power spying on another major power, and said this proves that the Chinese must be confronted, that we must end all diplomacy, that we can't talk to China, that will just reward it. That's as the Blinken visit has been rescheduled, we've heard echoes of those lines, that diplomacy is a way to reward the other side. So there is a lot of acrimony in popular U.S. politics, and the Chinese side responded very badly to the U.S. reaction to the balloon. Blinken, shortly after the incident, met with the top foreign policy official on the Chinese side, Wang Yi, at the Munich Security Conference. And they basically exchanged insults. The United States started saying that China might be planning on sending lethal weapons to Russia to support the Ukraine war. It never did give any evidence for that. When China proposed steps to pursue peace in Ukraine, the administration initially was very dismissive, much more dismissive than Zelensky, president of Ukraine, in fact. And the relationship really seemed to bottom out in the months that followed. But over the last month plus, we've seen a revival, hopefully a resumption of the diplomatic track. There have been a couple of high-level meetings. Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, met with Wang Yi in Vienna last month. Bill Burns, the CIA director, went to Beijing last month as well to conduct talks. So the high-level talks are moving now. But unlike the rather more hopeful period in January and February, where both sides really seemed committed to lowering tensions, the rancor in the relationship seems much more intense now. The possibilities for diplomatic advance seem to have attenuated, despite both sides having been relatively restrained over the months that followed. So we'll talk about what the prospects are here, but the balloon has cast a really ominous shadow over the possibilities for diplomacy.
Absolutely. And I just want to remind the audience, if you have any questions for either of our panelists or both, please put them in the Q&A and we'll try to answer as many as possible. Thank you, Jake, for setting that up. So what about the prospects? Michael, what do you think Blinken and his Chinese interlocutors will be discussing during this trip? Is he expected to meet with Xi Jinping? Any prospect of some kind of breakthrough?
Well, first, thanks very much, Kelley. Thanks for putting this on, and appreciate everybody watching. Let me start by saying that there are two senior U.S. officials who have had a press briefing, who have described very recently, I think it was yesterday, what this meeting is going to consist of, at least from the U.S. side. There are three objectives. One is to keep open lines of communication to avoid miscalculation. This is a regular mantra that the U.S. government says all the time about the relationship. We want to keep lines of communication open. We don't want miscalculations. So that's one goal. And I guess by showing up, you've, to a great extent, addressed that goal. The second is for the United States to stand up for its interests, its values. This, again, is a mantra often repeated by the US government, over and over. We're going to stand up for what we stand for, and we're going to push back against the Chinese, and that's, predictable. The third is to, quote unquote, explore areas of potential cooperation. There's a lot of weight put on that word explore. What does that mean? It's at least an acknowledgement that there's a need to try to advance interaction on areas of cooperation. However, there is also the emphasis that there's not going to be any really serious, what you call, deliverables coming out of this meeting. So don't expect in fact, there won't be any major breakthrough per se. There's not going to be some grand agreement that's going to be penned by both sides about anything. There's going to be perhaps some statements that are coordinated. There may be a joint statement, or there may be separate statements, but no concrete agreements that are designed to resolve specific issues. Nonetheless, the agenda for the meeting has been described by the US side as substantive and productive. So we really don't know what that means ultimately. But it's also been said that it's going to be a part of a critical series of engagements. So low expectations, which is probably good in terms of prior to the meeting. You don't want to set overly high expectations and promise too much. And possibly the beginning of meetings that will put a floor under the relationship, reduce tensions to some degree, and provide a basis for cooperating or developing lines of cooperation in the future. But it's the first step in what I think is going to be a fairly steep uphill climb. I don't know if Blinken will meet with Xi Jinping or not. We'll see. But I doubt that he will. I think he probably will just meet with his counterpart, Xingang, the foreign minister. And as I say, I don't think you're going to see major outcomes. But the question is, does it start a process? Finally start a process after 2.5 years of the Biden administration, in which the United States and China actually begin to talk substance and actually begin to put a real serious, durable floor under the relationship. But we shall see whether or not that actually comes out of this meeting.
So I want to stay with you for a second, Michael, for the next question, and go into a little greater depth on the specific security issues that are driving this relationship and many of the tensions, mainly Taiwan. Can you tell us how Taiwan has become such a flashpoint in the last 6 months? And I know it's been for even longer than that, but let's just take the last 6 months. And do you think that they will be talking about it specifically at all this weekend?
Well, let me take the second question first. Yes, I think they will be talking about it. Whether or not they will be actually saying anything of real substance beyond what they've said many, many, many times before is a real question mark. The US and China routinely talk about Taiwan, but in talking about it, they exchange talking points. They basically restate their positions, and they each point the finger at the other, essentially saying or implying that the other side needs to really change its behavior in order to improve the situation. Now, why has it come to this? Well, it's come to this in large part, I think, first of all, as a reflection of the larger strategic dynamic in the relationship, which has deteriorated over time, such that each side is increasingly very suspicious of the other's motives, intentions, etc., and strategic objectives, each thinking the other is trying to undermine it in a variety of different ways through concerted policies and actions, and that's their primary objective. And the Taiwan issue, since it has a lot of resonance in terms of the security environment within Asia, it's right there off the coast of China, it's right next to Japan, it has a vibrant democratic political system, which has supported at various times and currently does today a political party that in its party platform stands for Taiwan independence. That is obviously a major source of concern by the Chinese. And there's this, there's this understanding between the US and Chinese sides about how to keep some stability, but that has eroded over time. As the US has seen China as more of a threat, it's moved closer to Taiwan more and more. The Chinese then look at that as an erosion of the one China policy, and the Chinese increase their own assertiveness, military actions of one sort or another to put pressure on the Taiwan public and to also deter the United States. So you've got this kind of mutual negative dynamic in which both sides double down on deterrence signaling, each to the other, in the idea that this is going to stabilize the situation. Whereas what it's really doing is it's just deepening this cycle, causing each side to in turn increase their deterrence signaling, which then reduces the sense of confidence that either side is still committed to the original understanding that created stability over Taiwan, which was the US committed itself to a one China policy, and China committed itself to seeking peaceful unification as a first priority. That understanding has kept the peace for decades. And that understanding is exactly what is now eroding under the pressure of these constant iterative deterrence signaling that each side is giving to the other, with very little in the way of credible reassurances about their original understandings and why they still adhere to those original understandings. And that's where the most serious problem lies in the Sino-US relationship today, and where the two sides really need to focus if they want to see some constructive progress in their relationship as a whole.
Now, I know that's the biggest, probably the biggest security issue, but are there others in that region that might come up in terms of discussion this weekend? And I'm thinking some of the charges and complaints by US partners that China has been acting aggressively in their backyard. I'm thinking of the Philippines, I'm thinking of Vietnam. Are there other security issues that need an airing, or will this weekend?
Right. Well, it's possible that you could get as part of the overall interaction between the two sides, some statements on the US side cautioning against Chinese aggressive actions in the South China Sea, which is what you're referencing, or possibly with regard to the Sino-Japanese dispute over islands near islands that Japan has administrative authority over, or some other disputes. These are all primarily sovereignty territorial disputes that the Chinese are involved in, where the United States sees China as being too aggressive, trying to intimidate the other claimants, and the claimants are looking to the United States to defend them or defend their interests or back them in their positions. And so the United States will express concern over the continuation of security and stability regarding these disputes, and the Chinese will reiterate their position that the United States is, they'll either reiterate it explicitly or imply that the United States is really intruding in areas that it shouldn't be intruding in, that these are bilateral issues involving China and its neighbors, and that they will be negotiated eventually for some peaceful resolution if the United States doesn't intervene and make it into a much more hostile, confrontational kind of an issue. And it's that exchange of these talking points, if you will, that you'll see. I doubt very much if you will see anything of real substance beyond that.
Yeah. Well, let's shift over to Jake and economic issues and contentions between the two countries. Jake, what are the major points of contention between the two nations today? And do you expect any of them to be discussed during the meeting? I'm thinking about US export controls on microchips, China's banning of Micron, which is a US chip maker, Trump era tariffs. Are these substantive issues going to be discussed in any specificity, or are we going to be talking more broadly about areas of competition and cooperation?
Yeah, again, I mean, there's kind of a parallel here with the security issues. They're going to definitely talk about these issues, but the question is whether it will just be an exchange of talking points and an exchange of grievances, and each side asserting its priorities and the other side not really listening to why those priorities are meaningful to the other side, why they are legitimate and should be taken into account, why they might be able to work together to work out these problems. That is what has really been absent from the from the discussion around economic issues. There is a bit of a difference with the situation around Taiwan or in the South China Sea. The United States occupies a very clear dominant position in the global economy. The dollar is what the global financial system runs on. The American economy remains bigger than the Chinese economy, despite the United States having 5 times fewer people. So the United States is a far richer country. Despite a lot of rhetoric you hear from politicians, the American manufacturing sector is still quite large and important. Nonetheless, China has been able to assert forms of power and growth in the economic realms in recent years with significant, really incredible speed. China has moved into a position of dominance in a lot of manufacturing sectors. A lot of the sectors that both the Chinese and the American leadership consider to be essential to future growth in both of their countries. China is in a position to make a play for dominance in those sectors, even if they don't already have dominance in those sectors. And essentially what the United States has been doing under Biden is trying to limit the ability of China to make that play for dominance in these sectors that are considered strategically really important. So as you mentioned, semiconductors has been the most prominent of these. The Biden administration issued last October a set of restrictions on the most advanced semiconductors that amount to a blockade on Chinese companies' ability to access these chips, as well as the ability to produce them in China in the future. So American companies, American individuals were banned from selling materials, from setting up shop in China, from transferring know-how to China. And subsequently, the United States put a lot of pressure on its allies in the Netherlands and Japan, which also supply these chips and chip making facilities, to make sure that they joined the blockade. So what this represents on the Chinese side is an attempt to permanently subordinate China within the global economy, to prevent it from developing technologically, because the Chinese leadership thinks that these chips are going to be sent, and analysts agree on this point, that advanced chips are going to be central to the growth industries of the future, such as artificial intelligence, such as advanced robotics. So the fact that the United States has essentially said to China, I'm sorry, you're not going to have access to these chips, that tells China that the United States intends China to be permanently subordinate. On the US side, this is seen more as a national security issue, that we're not trying to keep China economically subordinate. We're not trying to prevent China from developing economically. We don't have a problem with China creating good jobs for its people or growing its economy. We're just worried about these chips falling into the hands of the People's Liberation Army and threatening American forces at some point. There's a bit of a distinction without a difference here, right? Like the advanced technologies such as microchips are so foundational to every application in the manufacturing economy going forward that you can't really separate these two. And certainly the United States says that it's separating these two, but there's not really any way to do so practically. So the United States has not thus far rolled out similar blockades on other advanced technologies, but it has said that it intends to do so. Sectors such as Jake Sullivan mentioned when he first discussed trying to keep Chinese technology permanently behind the United States, he mentioned clean energy and biotechnology. And so essentially the Chinese, if this strategy by the United States goes forward and is successful, this really deeply undermines the entire Chinese development strategy. The attempt to move the Chinese economy off of a really unhealthy dependence on the further expansion of a gigantic real estate bubble, the attempt to create high-value forms of production with good-paying jobs in these sectors as a growth engine to replace speculative investment in real estate. If China is unable to get around these blockades, develop its own technology so that it can compete in these fields, which is is sort of an open question. China has had a lot of success developing technologically, but it has done so through access to advanced technologies from other countries. So if China is unable to do this, this is a really serious, damaging blow to the future prospects of the Chinese economy. So essentially what we're seeing here is the United States is seeking to prevent China from moving into a position where it could gain dominance in strategically important economic sectors that would allow it to exert leverage against the United States and U.S. allies, and maintain the American position of dominance in the global economy. And China is of course very resentful about all of this. So that on the other hand, like the American side is not really hearing how important this is to the Chinese side and how threatening it is. On the other hand, the American side is talking about resilient supply chains, about the dangers that come with concentrating production, manufacturing production in a single country. Some of those dangers we saw during the pandemic, that production really essential production could get cut off if it shuts down in the one country that really dominates it. These I think are legitimate concerns on the part of the United States and many other countries, and China is not really hearing that. So what we're seeing in this exchange is that there are important issues, really, when it comes down to it, existential issues, because if a modern economy doesn't grow, it faces a really deep crisis. If the economy faces a crisis, the entire society is in danger. So these are potentially existential issues, and both sides are not really hearing the insecurities of the other side. They certainly are not making positive proposals to bring together and work together around these shared problems. Rather, the United States is pursuing a unilateral course. China is sort of unilaterally resisting to the extent that it can. So again, I don't really expect, there hasn't been any evidence yet that the two sides can listen to each other and really exchange productive ideas on these issues. I hope to see otherwise, but I wouldn't say I expect it.
One thing I wanted to ask you about on the U.S. side, talking about supply chains and the demand by a number of members here in Congress, or lawmakers and constituencies, talking about decoupling from China. And I've heard in the last month a number of Biden officials going out and saying, we don't necessarily support decoupling, that it would be a disaster for our economy, but we support de-risking. And I think Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, the other day said that in a House Financial Services Committee hearing. Can you explain just clearly what the difference might be? And is this a signaling by the Biden administration that it is willing, at least in this area, to tamp down some of the more aggressive rhetoric when it comes to the economic problems between the two nations?
Yeah, great question. I mean, there has been a lot of speculation since the Trump administration really ramped up economic coercion against China, imposed really significant tariffs against Chinese economy, and also attempted to destroy Huawei, which is the most successful Chinese multinational company, and really had a lot of success in wrecking some of Huawei's central lines of central markets. Ever since then, there's been a lot of speculation. Where is this really deeply embedded, enormously lucrative trade relationship between the two countries going? And we saw trade statistics for last year came out recently. U.S.-China bilateral trade is higher than it's ever been. So one thing that we can say is that thus far, the two economies have not broken apart. The trade is prospering on both sides. But nonetheless, as you're indicating, certainly if we look at the proposals in Congress and we look at the way that Republican Party critics of the Biden administration respond to the things that the Biden administration is saying, there is a lot of support to squeeze that relationship further and further and further. People increasing, and there's a lot of businesses are feeling pressure that even being active in China could leave them vulnerable to political criticism for supporting the goals of the Chinese Communist Party, or for having immoral contacts with China. So there is a real prospect and a lot of businesses are looking for, a lot of businesses that do some of their manufacturing in China are looking for other places to move at least some of that manufacturing. There is a lot of pressure kind of trying to pull apart these economies. What the Biden administration is talking about is decoupling, but only in these advanced sectors. So the sectors that the Biden administration has defined as strategic and important to the United States, maintaining its dominant position over the global economy, that is where the United States wants to separate the two economies and make sure that that U.S. companies or companies in allied countries dominate those sectors. They've been very clear about that. That is, they are responding both to the really terrible disruption that would come out of trying to fully separate the two economies, given how deeply they're entangled in global production. But they're also responding to a really intense unease on the part of a lot of third countries, including American allies, that do not want to see the kind of economic disorder that would come from more separation, or the kind of political ramifications of the two countries increasingly treating each other as enemies and seeing growth on either side as a threat to their own success as a country. So the Biden administration has been responsive to these concerns, but because the Biden administration hasn't been able to articulate a clear foundation for the relationship that isn't based on competition, competition that is generally conceptualized as zero-sum in nature, it's not clear how effective they'll be at warding off the pressures for further increasingly disruptive forms of separation.
Kelley, could I?
Yes, please.
Point on this? Totally agree with everything that Jake just said. I mean, I just to observe, it's very interesting to me that the position of the administration has not been entirely consistent on this issue. And Jake sort of alluded to this, and you did too in your question, Kelley. And I think the White House and to some degree the State Department had led a lot of the messaging on the economic and trade area, and did it in a rather zero-sum way, harkening back to Jake Sullivan's speech of some time ago, about which Jake mentioned, that the United States needs to stay ahead across the board in these high-tech areas, and the implication with the CHIPS Act and others is that we're really going to stop the Chinese from developing in this high-tech way. And there was a very vague sense about what the boundaries would be. More and more of these areas were defined in national security terms, so that even though they talked about a small yard and high walls, only these more specific high-tech areas, the definition of how far those extend and what are dual use, and to what extent are we really going to go and decouple in many areas, became very unclear. I think that other countries, including US allies, and Secretary Yellen, to some extent, pushed back against this trend. And that her speech that you referred to, Kelley, was a very interesting speech and very significant. She called for the continuation of high levels of trade, investment, tech interaction with the Chinese, avoiding radical decoupling, and solving financial problems together. I mean, it was a much more nuanced and much more positive kind of spin on the whole issue. And I think the use of the term de-risking now is really in part a response to all of this kind of pressuring. It's not decoupling, it's de-risking. We're not out to really just to sort of undermine China's development. We want to maintain contact and development in a variety of areas. I think but defining where those boundaries would be in this effort, I think, is what is really needed on the part of both the United States and China.
Yeah, absolutely. Talking a little bit about domestic pressures, how much do you think each side is playing to their domestic audience as we move towards this visit this weekend? As you know, Congress has been very hawkish on China security issues, so there's pressure to be tough. On the Chinese side, there were a number of Chinese state media stories that I came across this week in which commentators were suggesting that the Chinese believe the US is disingenuous and that their outreaches are an illusion or just so self-interested. How does each side get past these particular domestic pressures for the betterment of getting together diplomatically? And I don't know, either of you, if you'd like to answer that question.
Well, if I could, I think it's impossible to completely neutralize these domestic pressures. I think it's really part of the dynamic of these relationships between the administration and the Congress, and then public opinion in the U.S., and then in China, the relationship between the regime, the leadership, and the more hawkish elements within the public and in parts of the government as well. And believe me, they could be a lot more hawkish, those views, than the Chinese regime is at present. They advocate all kinds of extreme positions and do so very loudly and vocally, particularly online. So I don't think you're ever going to be able to completely neutralize this, but the two governments have a responsibility to establish a constructive and responsible approach to their relationship in ways that specifically push back against some of these more extreme domestic statements being made in the Congress and elsewhere. And I think the administration has tried to do this in a variety of different ways. It's tried to push back against some of the domestic pressures in the Congress on the Taiwan front through actions that it's taken to try to soften some of the language and some of the legislation that's been proposed or coming out of the Congress on Taiwan. But I don't think it's done enough in really trying to counter these voices. Again, particularly in the Congress. I can understand why they're walking a kind of a tightrope because of the exposure that would give them to attack from the Republican side and how it might influence, and I say might, influence public opinion in some ways that would be negative for the administration or for the U.S.-China relationship. So it's a tightrope that they're trying to walk here in dealing with domestic pressures while still hoping to get some kind of substantive movement forward in the relationship. But I doubt very much that we will see anything really significant in terms of forward movement, given those domestic pressures, until after the presidential election. I think a lot of the calculations that go on in the administration has to do with maintaining domestic political support, reducing the extent to which the Republicans have leverage through use of the China issue with the administration, and keeping that kind of political situation under control until Biden is reelected. And after that, perhaps you would see more substantive developments in various areas, but I'm unsure as to whether or not even then we would see it.
I want to reinforce what Michael said there, and I think this is true on both sides, that the Chinese government could be far more aggressive than it is. You wouldn't know that from some of the rhetoric in Washington right now. Chinese government is fairly restrained, both in terms of the way that it's retaliated against U.S. initiatives and its own sort of pursuit of military and economic goals. It has been relatively restrained, and the voices out there that are critical of not pursuing a more confrontational approach, those are there. They circulate widely. The Chinese government could be much more aggressive. The American government also could be much more aggressive, and this is something that the Chinese government hasn't recognized adequately. I think Xi Jinping mentioned recently that by name said that the United States was trying to contain and suppress China. This was unusual to name the United States in this way rather than just sort of imply it. But he said that the United States was trying to comprehensively contain and suppress China, and that's just not true. Like the Biden administration, I think the Biden administration has not fully recognized how threatening the steps that it's taking are to the Chinese government. But nonetheless, the Biden administration has been very carefully restricting the ambit of those forms of economic coercion that it's pursuing, the nature of its security initiatives. Both sides could be much more restrained. So I think that's the first point that needs to be made. On your question, Kelley, I think this is a really important question, and I don't think that either government is going to be able to effectively resist the pressure for greater confrontation if they are unable to articulate a positive basis for the relationship, right? Like if you want to say, these critics of mine, they are completely out there. What they're saying is groundless. I reject it. What I'm doing is absolutely the right thing to do. You need to actually believe that there's a positive reason that the United States and China should be in relation with each other. Not just, well, we don't want it to end up in a war, but there's nothing really positive the other side is doing or could do. there's not really anything that I can see valuable about the other side. Increasingly, both sides cannot see anything valuable about the other side. They cannot even see a world in which the two coexist, and their own side is able to succeed and thrive on its own terms. So if that's the case, then you're going to be constantly in a defensive crouch about not being more confrontational, because if there really is nothing positive that you can have about this relationship, then all you really are doing is trying to frustrate the aims of the other side, trying to reduce, trying to diminish and exclude the other side. And essentially that's what we've seen. So I think even as both sides have been less aggressive than they could have been, nonetheless, they're going to become like the trajectory is towards greater confrontation unless the two sides can articulate a positive basis for the relationship.
Well, let's move towards a more positive view. Michael, is there going to be any room to talk about issues that the two countries could actually cooperate on? And if so, what are those issues specifically that you think down the road, once we get to that point, that they could actually find ways of getting together?
Well, there's a significant number of issues, in fact, that the two governments and the two leaders, going back to the Bali summit last November, that was mentioned, that they've identified. They have stated that they want to work together for the success of dealing with the climate issue. They want to carry out cooperative activities in the area of public health and agriculture. They want to be able to resolve differences or reduce the level of tension, I should say, not really resolve differences, but reduce the level of tension regarding the Taiwan issue. They want to have a greater degree of ability to avoid financial problems in the global financial system. There's a whole host of different issues that they have already identified that they want to try to move forward on, and just haven't done so at this point. I think they need to, people often say this, you need to try to start relatively small with what's called low-hanging fruit. First thing you have to do is start getting back to some normalcy in terms of Sino-US or US and Chinese interactions, in terms of people-to-people issues, in terms of the visa issuance question, in terms of the reopening of consulates, in terms of the permission of Fulbright scholars to go back and study in China, and lowering of restraints on foreigners in China. There's a whole host of different issues that the two sides could move forward on that are very specific, but that would at least begin to establish a sense that there's a desire to try to lower the level of tension, lower the level of zero-sum behavior on both sides, and try to encourage greater contact, greater interaction between the two sides, and then build from there through what have supposedly been working groups that have been set up between the two sides to deal with some of these very discrete issues and problems. Now, part of the problem here is that the US and China have a somewhat different view about how you really can move forward in progress between the two sides. The US side talks primarily about establishing guardrails or limitations that would prevent us from getting into a severe crisis or a conflict, and then moving to achieve some kind of advances or progress in very discrete areas. The Chinese, however, say, look, we need to have a better understanding about our overall relationship. What is our strategic relationship here, and where is it going? Is there a credible recognition by both sides of the need to respect each other's vital interests? And the Chinese, of course, are always stressing this idea of having the United States not interfere in its vital interests, which is often code word for stop interfering in the Taiwan issue. But nonetheless, the Chinese have a more broad range kind of strategic sense connected to Taiwan, where they want to see some sort of progress in understanding before you can really make progress on these narrower issues. That is a kind of an obstacle in moving forward, and they have to be able to reach some kind of middle ground on this, such that the Chinese concerns are addressed to some degree, and the American concerns and the limitations and the so-called guardrails are set up to some degree. But the Chinese believe that unless there's a greater understanding, the guardrails that are set up by the United States will just be a way of putting a net underneath the relationship as the US continues to escalate its zero-sum policies against China. And that's the Chinese suspicion on that side. And I think there needs to be a serious effort to try to address that suspicion, as there should be to address the American suspicions of the Chinese that they really want to just use the relationship to try to lull the United States into a false sense of security or complacency about China, and they'll go ahead and push their objectives in a very zero-sum way as well. There needs to be a recognition by both sides that each side is contributing to this negative dynamic, and each side needs to do certain things, as Jake has just referenced, that will indicate a credible desire to meet the most serious concerns of the other by adopting certain changes in policies. And these have to happen on both sides. And if each side just continues to point fingers at the other, blame the other for everything that's going wrong, we're going to get nowhere.
Okay, we have about a little more than 10 minutes left, and we have a bunch of questions in the queue. And a lot of these questions are bouncing off of today's headlines, and people are interested in how some of these headlines are going to play, if at all, into the visit. Hugh Lee has a question. He says, Secretary Blinken mentioned one topic that he would like to discuss in his trip, the fentanyl crisis in the United States. Can either of you comment on how exactly China can or cannot help with that crisis? And we hear this coming a lot from Republicans who do blame China for this crisis and are making a big point of it across the country today. So what do you guys think about that?
I think the first thing to say is that the whole history, many decades now, of the drug war, the foreign policy aspects of the drug war, have been attempts to limit the supplies of illegal drugs coming into the United States. In the past, this is largely focused on Colombia or Mexico. Increasingly now, because of the collapse of the US-China relationship, people are pointing fingers at China around, and it's not that China is uninvolved. Chinese companies do supply precursor materials that are used in manufacturing fentanyl. That goes on to people die from overdoses in the United States. There's no question about that. The question is whether limiting supply is ever going to fix this problem. For decades and decades, the United States has tried to limit foreign supplies of illegal drugs, and when they were successful, sometimes quite brutally, for example, destroying the livelihoods of thousands and thousands of people in Colombia to get rid of coca growing operations. They successfully limited the production of coca leaves, but that didn't limit the import of cocaine into the United States. It just moved someplace else. So there are things that China could do to help enforce regulations around the shipment of these things. I think that the discussion in the United States has tended to really unrealistically portray China as having sort of complete control over everything that's happening in its economy. China does not have control over, the Chinese government does not have control over everything that's happening in its economy. Trust me, they really would like to have that control. They definitely don't. The Chinese economy is particularly in sectors like this, a sort of Wild West free market paradise where the government cannot exert effective control. Now, if there were greater political will, perhaps they could better limit some of these precursor drugs that are being shipped to Mexico for production of fentanyl. I think that is a possibility. If that's what you were pursuing, you would want China to have some stake in the relationship, so there would be a reason for them to do this. And most of the people who are pointing fingers at China around this are asking for greater confrontation. So it's not really a workable proposal. I support cooperation on these issues. I don't think it's bad by any means. I am a little skeptical about how successful this is going to be, even if China did manage to exert control over every single small producer of every single thing in its economy and cut off the entire supply of fentanyl. It would just shift to some other country that had less state capacity over its economy. I think the solution to this, as to many of the things that China is blamed for, lies within the United States. We need to think seriously about what's going on in our society and how we can fix it, rather than saying that China is at fault.
Well, we'll move on, but thank you very much. And thank you for the question, Hugh. Here's an interesting question. I want to pose this one to Michael because I'm sure, you've had this posed to you before. Jane Chang has asked, how arms sales, U.S. arms sales and military training to Taiwan, how is that in line with the United States respect and support of the one China policy? He says, it's obvious hypocrisy to me. I guess what he's getting at is we seem to be pushing the line with the more we give weapons and assistance and putting troops into Taiwan, while on the other hand saying, no, we continue to respect this one China policy. Has there been an off-kiltering of that balance? And does the questioner have a point that it seems like we're trying to have it both ways here?
Well, the question really points to a very complex and difficult issue that exists within the U.S.-China-Taiwan relationship, going right back to the beginning of normalization in U.S.-China relations and diplomatic recognition in 1979. It was stated at that time by the United States that the U.S. would steadily reduce its support, its defense assistance support to Taiwan over time, with the understanding or the assumption that this would occur in a larger context of reduction in tensions between the U.S. and China coming out of diplomatic recognition and that era. And so there was that kind of a statement, and yet at the same time, it was very clear through presidential statements in the Congress, et cetera, that U.S. sales of defensive equipment to Taiwan would continue if there was a concern that there was a potential for China to exert some military pressure against Taiwan. And indeed, the Taiwan Relations Act, which was established at that time, stated that the United States would maintain its own defensive capabilities and it would continue to provide defensive-oriented assistance to Taiwan as needed. And so you had that from the very beginning. Now, the question is, what is the assessment of the threat from China? What kinds of support, defensive support and weaponry does Taiwan need? And to what degree does this actually shore up stability as opposed to provoke the Chinese so that they in turn double down on their defense deployments against Taiwan over time? And this has been a continuous problem back and forth in the relationship. And I don't see any clear resolution to it under current conditions, but there is a desire, I think, by the United States to provide defensive assistance to Taiwan that is indeed defensive, that is designed to interdict and deflect a Chinese attack on Taiwan if that were to occur, and is not, if you will, provocative through the acquisition of offensive capabilities by Taiwan that may lead Taiwan to do certain things in a crisis that would be destabilizing. I think the U.S. is very aware of that, but you still nonetheless have continuous pressure, particularly in the Congress, to increase steadily the level of defensive military and to some degree offensive military support for Taiwan. And whether or not that has an impact on the one China policy, people in the Congress will just say, well, we continue to uphold the one China policy, but we're going to definitely have these types of defense assistance to Taiwan. And that creates real tension, I think, between any administration and the Congress on this issue. It's not one that's going to go away easily, but I think it can be controlled. It does require, to establish greater control, it requires Taiwan to do more on its own, and not just through U.S. assistance, but to do more on its own to improve its own defense capabilities, its own resilience against attack, its own capabilities of its military, particularly its soldiers who don't serve long enough in the military as they should. You don't have an adequate enough civil defense system within Taiwan. The territory is simply not established well enough to be able to significantly deflect a possible attack from China. So Taiwan needs to do a lot more in a responsible way to increase its own defense. as the United States assists Taiwan, and as the United States, nonetheless, despite all this, reassures China that despite the assistance that's been longstanding to Taiwan on the defense area, that it still upholds limits on the extent to which it would support official ties with Taiwan, or certainly not Taiwan independence, etc. The United States needs to inject greater credibility into those kinds of statements alongside improvements in the defense area.
Okay, I'm gonna ask, I might be the last question, but we'll see, and maybe both of you can speak to it. Richard Wright has a statement and a question. He says, clearly the US is approaching China somewhat reminiscently of Kissinger's trip to again split China-Russia relations. And I, meaning Richard, include Iran in all of this. Could you speak to the geopolitical implications? You know, I have the same question. Is there motivation here to ensure that Russia and China do not work together, particularly on the front of Ukraine, but together geopolitically? And is it going to be effective? And here's an even broader question. Has the United States spread itself thin? You know, it has this war in Eastern Europe it's focused on, it is fully invested in, but yet it has all of these issues here that we've discussed today, threatening on and halfway on another part of the world. Can it handle both theaters at the same time? Throw all that out there for our last question, I guess.
I think that certainly is part of what's going on. It's part of some of the considerations in the administration. I mentioned earlier that China's very rather vague proposal for how to pursue peace in Ukraine. The administration initially responded very badly to that and tried to discredit the motivations of China behind making that proposal. Subsequently, then they shifted tack on that and said, no, actually, China could be involved in peace, and we would support that because what we want is peace. I think that is absolutely the right position substantively. I think that's the right position diplomatically. You don't. There's just no need to dismiss other people's efforts, even if you don't think they're going to bear fruit, and poison your relationship with them. You can just watch it fail if you think it's going to fail. So I think that's the right orientation on its own merits, but I suspect that it is also a concern about China and Russia aligning too strongly. This is something that the administration has gotten a little bit more sensitive to. I think at the same time, it's important to recognize that I think the administration itself has said quite explicitly, it does not see Russia as the biggest threat, it sees China as the biggest threat. And Blinken, when he gave his sort of programmatic speech on the administration's China policy last year, he said quite explicitly, Russia is very disruptive and is doing bad things, but the real threat to the rules-based international order is China because it's far more powerful. China has power that Russia does not to overturn the system. I think that is a failure really to analyze China's own interest in keeping the system, reforming it certainly, but China benefits massively from the existing framework, a prosperous global trading system, a peaceful regional environment. China has a real interest in, it does want to make some changes, but it has a real interest in basically keeping the system that the United States has put together over the last 30 years. And for the United States to fail to recognize that, I think really misses an opportunity. But thinking about how this plays in the U.S., Russia, China triangle, the administration, I think, is pretty committed to this idea. China is the real threat. That's the place that we need to focus on. We also have to make sure that Russia doesn't succeed in violating the basic rules of the so-called rules-based international order. But our attention needs to focus on China. As long as that's the orientation of the administration, I think any strategy to try to effectively split the two countries is going to be quite difficult. Now, China has its own motivations for helping support peace in Ukraine. China is not at all comfortable with the ways that Russia is destabilizing things precisely because China has a real stake in the existing global system. So that doesn't mean that China is being disingenuous when it says it wants peace, and that doesn't mean that there is no role for China in that process. It is going to be quite a tricky sort of diplomatic dance, though, because the U.S. and China are having a hard time seeing, how their futures align.
Michael, do you want to quickly add to that, or?
Well, we're over time already, so maybe.
Okay, well, I wanted to ask.
Maybe I'll just say, I agree. I think that, of course, the U.S. wants to have communication with China in part in order to be able to credibly convey certain messages and concerns that have something to do with Russia. And so it wants a workable relationship with the Chinese in order to have, hopefully, the Chinese in order to get the Chinese to avoid doing certain things that would really, really provoke problems both in Europe and with the United States.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a question that like you would most likely see in mainstream news outlets. I want to ask you each, how do you feel about this upcoming visit of Antony Blinken to Beijing bearing fruit? Do you feel positive about it, negative, or meh? Michael.
Oh gosh, as I've said, I feel positive about it in the sense that I think it reflects a certain kind of recognition by both sides that they really do need to try to interact and engage. But it's only the first step. So I have cautious optimism, but in terms of the longer term, I don't believe it's going to address the fundamental problems that we've both been talking about that still really obstruct the kind of relationship that's needed. So what does that lead you to? I mean, it's a kind of a cautious optimism, I hope.
Jake?
I don't think the leadership on either side is really in a position right now in terms of their own strategic thinking and definition of their interests to make good on the possibilities here. On the other hand, I think, and this is something that deserves further discussion, the fact that the U.S. and China are not spiraling further down towards ripping each other apart does create an opening for those of us who want to see a constructive relationship between the two sides. Now, ultimately, it's the two governments of the countries that are going to have to decide on a constructive relationship, but they are open to being pressured by outside actors, such as third countries and such as the people of the United States. I think we shouldn't just sit back and be spectators in this. We live in a democracy. The Chinese people do not enjoy this, enjoy the same possibilities, but we live in a democracy, and we can impress upon our leaders that they need to change course. So that's my job. And I think, I welcome anyone else who wants to support those efforts.
Excellent. Thank you both for an amazing conversation. I know we covered a huge breadth of topics here, and you guys were absolutely on point. I want to, before we leave, remind folks that Michael will be right back here on Wednesday, June 21st, to talk about a paper that he wrote for the Quincy Institute with Andy Bacevich, a restraint approach to U.S.-China relations, reversing the slide towards crisis and conflict, that will talk really about how restraint and the restraint strategy can be, how we can see our relationship with China through that particular lens. And we have a great panel set up with Michael Mazar, Kristen Gunnis, Michael, and moderating Sarang Shadori, who is our Director of Studies at the Quincy Institute. So please check the Quincy website for that. Again, that's Wednesday from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. On this Zoom channel. I wanted to thank everybody for being here today and for the fantastic questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to them all, and hope to see you all soon.